At 2:30 in the morning, 4 drones lifted off the southern coast of Iran and turned toward the busiest oil choke point on the planet. Their target wasn't a military base, it wasn't a warship. It was ordinary commercial tankers, moving through a waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the world's crude oil every single day. None of those drones reached a ship, none of them reached a sailor. Every one of them was shot down over open water before it got anywhere close to the shipping lanes. And what happened in the hours after that failed attack tells you almost everything you need to know about where this war actually stands, 99 days after it began. This is the story of one night in the Strait of Hormuz, and why it matters far more than a single failed drone strike should. Because underneath the noise, underneath the claims and counterclaims, there's a pattern forming. And once you see that pattern, you start to understand something the headlines aren't quite saying out loud. One side in this war is running out of things to lose, and the other side knows it. We've reached day 99 of this conflict, which on its own is worth pausing on. Wars that stretch this long tend to settle into rhythms, and rhythms are exactly where the real story tends to hide. It's easy to watch a single night of strikes and counterstrikes and treat it as an isolated headline. It's much harder, but far more useful, to step back and ask what 100 days of this exact same rhythm actually adds up to. That's what we're going to do here, because the answer to that question says more about where this war is actually headed than any single missile launch ever could. Let's set the stage first, because you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is before you can understand why a handful of drones there can rattle global markets and trigger a military response within hours. It's a narrow stretch of water, barely over 20 miles wide at its tightest point, separating Iran from Oman. Through that narrow gap moves an enormous share of the planet's oil supply, tankers lined up single file through 2 narrow shipping lanes, one heading in, one heading out. Close that strait, even partially, even for a few days, and the shockwaves hit gas prices, shipping insurance, and global markets almost immediately. That's exactly why Iran has treated this waterway as leverage since this conflict began. Control the strait, and you control a pressure point that the entire world feels. According to the material describing that night, the sequence began with the Iranian side making a move first. Reports describe Iranian forces opening fire on 4 oil tankers attempting to pass through the strait without what amounted to Tehran's approval, stopping one after a warning shot and turning the others back. Then came the drones, 4 of them, launched toward the waterway itself, aimed at the tankers and shipping lanes still trying to move through. According to the material, U.S. forces intercepted all 4 before they reached any vessel. Stopping 4 drones cleanly, all of them, with 0 ships damaged and 0 casualties, is not a trivial outcome. It's the kind of result that requires an enormous amount of coordinated technology working in sequence. Technology most people watching this war unfold have never had explained to them in plain language. We'll get into exactly how that intercept happened in a moment, because it's the part of this story that actually explains everything else that followed. After the drones went down, the material describes the American response shifting from defense to offense. Hess aircraft and drones reportedly struck Iranian coastal surveillance radar sites, the installations that give Iran's military its ability to see and track activity across the strait and the wider Gulf region. Footage described in the material shows a communications tower reduced to wreckage, apparently part of the same strike package targeting radar and communications infrastructure on islands along Iran's coast. The stated purpose of these strikes, according to the reporting, was defensive, eliminating the sensors that Iran had reportedly used to coordinate and direct attacks on shipping in the first place. Think about what that actually means tactically. It's one thing to shoot down the drones that are already in the air. It's another thing entirely to go after the eyes and ears that let an adversary launch, track, and coordinate those attacks to begin with. One is a temporary fix, the other is closer to permanent. Every radar site that goes dark is one less way Iran can see what's coming, and one less way Iran can effectively coordinate its own attacks going forward. That distinction matters enormously for understanding the rest of this story, because this wasn't a single exchange of fire. It was a layered response designed to remove Iran's ability to repeat the attempt. But Iran, as it has done repeatedly throughout the length of this war, chose to answer with escalation rather than de-escalation. According to the material, several hours after the radar strikes, Iranian forces launched 7 ballistic missiles toward Bahrain and Kuwait, both close U.S. partners in the region, hosting American military infrastructure. 6 of those 7 missiles were intercepted before reaching their targets. The 7th reportedly malfunctioned and came down short, never reaching its intended destination at all. Here's where the story takes on its most revealing detail. Following that missile exchange, an advisor reportedly connected to Iran's leadership went on camera and claimed, according to the material, that Iran's missile supply was effectively unlimited, while America's missile defense systems were running out of interceptors. Now, that specific quote and its exact attribution can't be independently verified here, so it deserves to be treated with real caution rather than repeated as confirmed fact. But whether or not the particular line was said word for word, The broader claim behind it, that Iran can keep producing missiles faster than America can keep shooting them down, is a claim that Iranian officials have made repeatedly throughout this war as a form of psychological pressure. It's worth understanding why that claim doesn't hold up well against what actually happened that same week. The same 6 missiles being called part of an unlimited arsenal ended up as wreckage scattered across the desert floor and the ocean, intercepted before they ever reached their targets. Iran's own state messaging apparatus, meanwhile, pushed a very different narrative. According to the material, officials claimed the strike had significantly damaged the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, a claim that U.S. Central Command directly and publicly denied, stating there were no reports of harm to American personnel and that the damage claims were false. This is a pattern that has repeated throughout this conflict. Iran makes an assertive claim about battlefield success. American officials respond with a flat, specific denial. And more often than not, independent evidence, satellite imagery, footage, and on the ground reporting from unaffiliated observers tends to back the American version of events rather than the Iranian one. So what actually explains how the U.S. managed to intercept every single drone in that first wave and 6 out of 7 ballistic missiles in the second? This is where the story stops being about one night in the Gulf and starts being about how modern American military technology is layered together into something close to an integrated shield. And it's worth walking through it step by step, because understanding this layered system is the key to understanding why Iran's attacks have consistently failed to produce the results Tehran keeps claiming. The first layer is detection, and it starts long before any weapon is ever fired. Long-range maritime patrol aircraft and surveillance drones stitch together a constant picture of activity across the Gulf and the Strait from above. Naval destroyers equipped with advanced radar systems scan the sky and the sea simultaneously, watching for launches in real time. Satellites overhead monitor known launch sites around the clock. By the time an Iranian drone clears the coastline, there's a strong likelihood its flight path is already being tracked by multiple sensors at once, feeding a single unified picture to commanders and weapon systems positioned to respond. In military terms, this is called sensor-to-shooter integration, and it's the foundation everything else in this layered defense depends on. You cannot intercept what you cannot see, and American forces in this theater have built an enormous amount of redundant, overlapping visibility, specifically so that nothing slips through unnoticed. The second layer is air dominance and electronic warfare, and this is the part of modern combat that almost never makes it into public discussion, even though it may be the most consequential. Fighter aircraft patrol the airspace, providing a persistent presence and rapid strike capability. But working alongside them are specialized electronic warfare aircraft, whose entire purpose is to jam enemy radar and communication systems until the other side effectively goes blind and deaf. According to the material, when these jamming aircraft are active, Iranian radar screens and communication channels reportedly degrade into static, cutting off the coordination Iranian forces would otherwise rely on to direct an attack or respond to one. Meanwhile, American systems remain unaffected. This kind of electronic disruption doesn't get filmed, doesn't produce dramatic footage, and rarely gets mentioned in casual coverage of this war. But it may be doing more to determine outcomes in these exchanges than any missile or bomb involved. The third layer is where this story becomes genuinely interesting from a strategic and economic standpoint, because it directly overturns a criticism that's been leveled at American military spending for years. For a long time, one of the most common critiques of U.S. air defense was straightforward. It's absurdly expensive to shoot down a cheap drone using a multi-million-dollar missile. If an adversary can build cheap, one-way attack drones by the thousands for a fraction of the cost of the interceptors needed to stop them, that adversary can eventually win a war of economic attrition, simply by exhausting the other side's more expensive stockpile. That was a legitimate criticism for a long time. It doesn't appear to hold up nearly as well anymore. According to the material, American fighter aircraft are now increasingly equipped with laser-guided rockets originally designed for other purposes, but repurposed specifically as a cost-effective solution against slow-moving drone threats, priced at roughly $35,000 per shot, rather than millions. A single fighter can reportedly carry dozens of these rockets when configured specifically for anti-drone missions. Given that the kind of one-way attack drones Iran has relied on throughout this war tend to be slow, low-flying, and relatively unsophisticated in their evasive capability, often powered by little more than a small engine comparable to something you'd find in a lawnmower. Engaging them with a comparatively cheap precision rocket instead of an expensive guided missile represents a direct and deliberate correction to that old cost imbalance criticism. It's a fair fight in economic terms even when the underlying technology gap between the two sides isn't remotely close, because the goal isn't proving which side has better engineering. The goal is making sure every intercepted drone costs less to shoot down than it cost the other side to build and launch in the first place. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it flips a criticism that's followed American defense spending for years into something closer to a genuine advantage. Critics have long pointed out that if a war becomes a contest of cheap drones against expensive interceptors, the side building the cheap drones eventually wins by attrition, simply by forcing the other side to burn through its more expensive stockpile faster than it can be replenished. That argument assumed the expensive side had no cheaper alternative. According to the material, that assumption no longer holds. When a $35,000 rocket can reliably bring down a drone that itself may have cost tens of thousands of dollars to build, the economics of a prolonged drone war shift meaningfully in favor of whoever has already made that adjustment. Closer to the ships themselves, close-in weapon systems mounted on naval vessels serve as a last line of defense, firing a dense wall of rapid cannon fire at anything that manages to slip past the earlier layers. And according to the material, an even newer and even cheaper layer has entered the picture. Directed energy weapons, essentially ship-mounted lasers capable of downing a drone for what amounts to the cost of the electricity required to fire them. A senior U.S. commander in the region reportedly described this shift plainly, framing it as finally getting on the advantageous side of the cost equation, using weapons costing a fraction of what the drones themselves cost to build. The fourth layer is reserved specifically for the threats serious enough to justify genuinely expensive countermeasures, and this is the layer that mattered most in the ballistic missile exchange against Bahrain and Kuwait. Ballistic missiles represent a fundamentally different category of threat than slow-moving attack drones. They travel far faster, carry far larger warheads, and require far more sophisticated interception technology to reliably stop. This is where naval destroyers equipped with advanced interceptor missiles come into play, systems capable of striking an incoming ballistic missile during its boost phase shortly after launch, at a cost that can run well over $2 million per interceptor. Ground-based interceptor batteries provide another layer of protection at shorter and medium ranges. And at the very highest layer sits terminal high-altitude area defense, a system designed to strike incoming ballistic missiles at extreme altitude, essentially using a massive kinetic interceptor with no explosive warhead of its own, relying purely on the force of impact at tremendous speed to destroy its target before it can descend toward its intended destination. This explains why 6 of the 7 missiles fired that day never reached Bahrain or Kuwait. And it also explains something subtler about the 7th missile, the one that malfunctioned and came down harmlessly in the desert. According to the material, the missile apparently didn't need to be intercepted at all, because its flight path was likely assessed as non-threatening almost immediately after launch. That distinction matters. It suggests that American tracking systems aren't simply firing interceptors reflexively at every launch detected. They're assessing trajectory and threat level in real time and reserving the most expensive countermeasures, specifically for missiles that pose genuine danger, rather than wasting a multi-million-dollar interceptor on something already destined to miss its target on its own. The 5th and final layer, described in the material, is retaliation, and this is where the story takes an interesting turn, because according to the material, American forces have started using a low-cost attack drone of their own, one deliberately modeled on the same basic design philosophy as the cheap Iranian drones that have caused so much disruption throughout this war, reportedly costing around $35,000 per unit, a fraction of what a traditional cruise missile or guided munition would cost. This drone has apparently been used specifically to strike Iranian radar and early warning infrastructure, effectively turning the same low-cost, mass-producible drone concept that Iran has leaned on throughout this conflict back against the systems Iran depends on to coordinate its own attacks. Put all 5 of these layers together, and you start to understand why Iran's repeated attempts to disrupt shipping and strike U.S. Aligned targets in the Gulf keep producing the same basic outcome. Drones get detected before they arrive. Radar and communications infrastructure meant to coordinate further attacks get systematically dismantled. Cheap countermeasures handle the cheap threats. Expensive countermeasures are reserved specifically for the rare threats serious enough to warrant them. And American forces increasingly answer provocation, not just with defense, but with low-cost retaliatory strikes of their own aimed at further eroding Iran's ability to repeat the attempt. This is where the deeper strategic picture starts to come into focus, and it's worth stepping back from the individual details of this one incident to understand the broader trajectory of this conflict. Since this war began, the material describes a consistent pattern repeating itself over and over. Iran launches an attack using drones, missiles, or naval assets. That attack gets substantially neutralized, and in the process, Iran loses equipment, infrastructure, or capability that it cannot easily or quickly replace, while gaining essentially nothing measurable in return. That's not a stalemate. A stalemate implies both sides are roughly holding steady. What this actually resembles is a slow, ongoing reduction of what Iran is capable of doing, incident by incident, each one chipping away at resources and infrastructure that took years and enormous investment to build in the first place. Why does Iran keep doing this despite the pattern being so consistently unfavorable? According to the material's own framing, the answer comes down to economic desperation. Iran is described as seeking access to a substantial sum in frozen financial assets and relief from the sanctions that have been strangling its economy since this conflict escalated. Every drone launched, every missile fired, functions less as a genuine military maneuver with realistic odds of tactical success, and more as a form of pressure, an attempt to make the political and economic cost of continued confrontation higher for the United States than the cost of simply granting Iran the financial relief it's seeking. The problem, at least based on the pattern described here, is that each of these pressure attempts keeps getting neutralized before it can create the kind of leverage Iran needs, while simultaneously costing Iran resources it cannot easily replace. There's a broader economic dimension to this too that's worth understanding, because it explains why the stakes here extend far beyond a single night of drone strikes and missile intercepts. The blockade and disruption around the Strait of Hormuz has reportedly been costing Iran hundreds of millions of dollars per day in lost revenue that would otherwise be flowing to the regime and its military infrastructure. That's an enormous, compounding financial drain, the kind of pressure that becomes more unsustainable with every additional week it continues. Every day the strait remains disrupted is another day that specific revenue stream stays cut off, and every failed attack that fails to change that outcome represents lost military capacity gained in exchange for essentially nothing. Think about what that kind of daily financial bleed actually does to a government over time, especially one already operating under heavy international sanctions. Militaries need fuel, spare parts, salaries, and constant resupply of exactly the kind of drones and missiles being lost in these repeated exchanges. Cut off hundreds of millions of dollars a day for long enough, and even a government determined to project strength eventually has to start making harder choices about where its remaining money actually goes. That's likely part of why Iran keeps returning to the same basic playbook of attacking shipping and regional targets, despite the pattern of failure. It isn't necessarily because Iranian military planners believe each individual attack will succeed. It may be because the alternative, simply absorbing the financial pressure without responding at all, risks looking like open capitulation. To a domestic audience, the regime still needs to convince that it remains in control of the situation. That's an important distinction to keep in mind whenever you see a new round of Iranian claims about damaged American installations or destroyed equipment. Some of these claims may be aimed less at changing the actual military situation on the ground and more at managing a domestic narrative, reassuring a population that's likely feeling the economic squeeze directly through fuel shortages, inflation, and disrupted trade. When 6 missiles fail and one becomes a headline anyway framed as a strike on a major American base, that's not necessarily evidence of confusion. It may be a deliberate choice to prioritize the story that keeps domestic morale intact over the far less flattering story that keeps repeating itself on the actual battlefield. It's worth widening the lens even further because this same night described in the material wasn't happening in isolation. According to the material, on the very same night as this exchange in the Gulf, Russia launched a massive drone and missile barrage against Ukraine, reportedly involving several hundred one-way attack drones alongside dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles, resulting in multiple deaths and dozens of injuries. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. It's essentially the same tactical playbook being used in an entirely different theater of conflict thousands of miles away, overwhelming an opponent's air defenses with sheer numbers of cheap, mass-produced drones mixed with a smaller number of more capable missiles designed to punch through whatever gaps that drone saturation manages to create. What makes this worth paying attention to is that Ukraine, out of sheer necessity, has spent years refining its ability to detect, track, and shoot down exactly this kind of massed drone attack, arguably becoming one of the most experienced forces on the planet at doing so under real combat conditions, night after night. There's a genuine argument to be made that lessons learned defending against Shahed-style drone saturation attacks in Ukraine have direct relevance to defending against the same tactics in the Gulf, and that military planners in both theaters likely have real incentive to study what's working and what isn't across both conflicts simultaneously, given how similar the underlying drone technology and attack patterns appear to be. It's worth remembering where this shared drone technology actually originated. Iran has been one of the primary suppliers of the exact drone design that Russia now mass produces and launches against Ukrainian cities on a near nightly basis. So, in a strange, roundabout way, both of these wars are being fought partly with the same underlying hardware lineage, just deployed at different scales and against different kinds of defenses. Ukraine has been forced to intercept these drones over populated cities, where a miss carries an immediate civilian cost that shapes the entire calculus of how and when to engage. The Gulf presents a different set of constraints: more open water, fewer densely populated target areas directly in the flight path, but the fundamental challenge, detecting and destroying large numbers of cheap, slow-moving drones before they reach anything valuable, remains functionally identical. Any refinement one side makes in solving that problem is potentially valuable intelligence for the other, whether that exchange of lessons happens formally through Allied coordination or simply through military analysts on both sides studying publicly available footage and outcomes. There's also a coincidence in timing here that's worth noting without overstating its significance. According to reports connected to this same period, a phone call reportedly took place between the American and Russian presidents around this same general window. Details of what was actually discussed haven't been made fully public, and it would be speculation to draw a firm connection between that call and the drone barrage against Ukraine happening on the same night. But it does underline something worth remembering about this entire moment in global affairs. These conflicts, Iran and the Gulf, Russia and Ukraine, are not happening in separate, unconnected bubbles. They're unfolding against the backdrop of the same handful of major powers, all watching each other's moves, all factoring outcomes in one theater into their calculations for the other. There's one more thread worth touching on briefly, mostly because it illustrates how much noise and speculation tends to surround stories like this. According to the material, footage reportedly showing an unusual aircraft with an unfamiliar wing design was captured near a restricted military testing area, sparking speculation across aviation circles that it might represent an early demonstrator aircraft connected to America's next-generation stealth fighter program. It's important to be direct about the actual state of that claim. This remains unverified speculation based on a single piece of footage, not confirmed information about any specific aircraft or program. Next-generation fighter programs are frequently the subject of exactly this kind of speculation long before anything is officially confirmed. And viral footage, claiming to show a mysterious new aircraft near a well-known testing facility, is a recurring phenomenon that has happened many times before with programs that later turned out to be something else entirely, or nothing at all. It's worth watching for further developments, but it shouldn't be treated as confirmation of anything specific at this stage. Bring all of these threads back together, and a clearer picture starts to form of where this conflict actually stands, 99 days in. This wasn't a night where Iran achieved a meaningful tactical victory, whatever the messaging coming out of Tehran might claim. It was a night where a drone attack failed completely, where the infrastructure meant to coordinate future attacks was significantly degraded, and where a follow-up missile barrage was almost entirely intercepted, at a fraction of the cost that older, more reactive American defense doctrine would have required. Every layer of this system, detection, air dominance, low-cost drone defense, high-value missile defense, and low-cost retaliation, worked together in sequence to produce an outcome that heavily favored the side absorbing the attack, rather than the side launching it. That doesn't mean this war is close to over, and it doesn't mean Iran's calculus is going to change overnight, simply because one more attack failed to produce results. Regimes under this kind of sustained economic and military pressure don't always respond rationally to repeated failure. Sometimes they escalate further precisely because de-escalation would mean acknowledging just how much ground has already been lost. But the pattern described here, night after night, attack after attack, interception after interception, tells its own story regardless of how either side chooses to frame it publicly. One side is demonstrating it can absorb repeated attacks with a defense system built in careful, deliberate layers, matching cheap countermeasures to cheap threats and reserving expensive countermeasures for the rare moments that genuinely demand them. The other side is spending resources it increasingly cannot afford to lose, in exchange for outcomes that keep failing to shift the underlying balance of power in the region. 99 days into this conflict, that imbalance is the real story, far more than any single night's headline about drones or missiles. Every failed attack is one more data point in a pattern that's becoming harder to ignore. And the longer that pattern continues, the more it starts to look less like a war being actively fought to a draw, and more like a slow, steady accounting of exactly how much a regime can afford to keep losing before the numbers simply stop adding up. There's a version of this story that gets told in headlines, one built around whichever side issued the more dramatic statement that day. Iran claims a base was cratered. America denies it. A missile is fired. Some are stopped. One isn't. That version of the story resets every single day, treating each incident as a standalone event with no memory of everything that came before it. But wars aren't actually won or lost one headline at a time. They're won or lost in the accumulation, in the slow arithmetic of what each side can afford to keep spending, keep losing, keep rebuilding, night after night, for as long as it takes the other side to either run out of resolve or run out of resources. On the numbers available so far, one side is spending expensive interceptors sparingly, reserving them for the threats that actually warrant that cost, while answering the cheaper, more frequent threats with cheaper countermeasures built specifically for that job. The other side is spending missiles and drones it cannot easily replace, in exchange for outcomes that keep failing to move the underlying situation in its favor, while still needing to tell its own population and its own military rank and file that something is being won. That gap between what's actually happening on the water and in the air, and what's being said about it afterward, is where this story really lives. And it's a gap that tends to only widen the longer a war like this drags on, because reality has a way of catching up with rhetoric eventually, even when it takes 99 days or more to get there.